The 1850s, they weren't just another decade in American history. Think of them more like a 10-year pressure cooker. Every single new law, every court case, every single attempt to compromise, it all just cranked up the heat over the issue of slavery, pushing a nation that was already divided right to the edge of the Civil War.
So how did it all go so wrong? I mean, how did compromises, things that were supposed to hold the country together, actually end up ripping it apart? And get this, how did one single law manage to turn ordinary citizens in the North, many who hated slavery, into unwilling participants in the whole system? We're going to dig into the answers.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with the crisis of 1850. Then we'll look at the compromises that just didn't work. We'll see how violence exploded in Kansas, and we'll break down a Supreme Court ruling that just rocked the nation. And finally, we'll look at the last few events that made war pretty much inevitable, all before a quick review of the key facts.
So our story really starts right after the Mexican-American War. The U.S. just got its hands on this enormous chunk of land, the Mexican cession. And that victory immediately set off a huge national crisis over one simple but incredibly explosive question. Was this new territory going to be free, or was it going to be slave?
Now, even before the war was officially over, the Wilmot Proviso tried to answer that question. It proposed a flat-out ban on slavery in any territory won from Mexico. Now, the bill never actually became a law, but wow, it drew a sharp line in the sand. From that moment on, basically every political debate was going to be about slavery's expansion. By 1850, the North and South wanted completely opposite things. The North was pushing to let California in as a free state and wanted to ban the slave trade in Washington, D.C. The South, on the other hand, demanded the right to take enslaved people west and insisted on a much stronger law to recapture anyone who escaped. Congress was just completely deadlocked.
And into this mess steps Senator Henry Clay, a guy known as the Great Compromiser. He took all these competing demands and bundled them into one giant bill, hoping he could just solve everything in one go. But the debate that followed, man, it was one of the most intense in the history of Congress. So Clay's giant bill? It failed. But then Senator Stephen Douglas had a clever idea. He broke the bill up into 5 separate pieces and managed to get every single one of them passed. The final deal was a really delicate balancing act. For the North, California became a free state, and for the South, a powerful, brand-new Fugitive Slave Act. It was a deal that a lot of people were really hoping would save the Union.
Let's really focus on that Fugitive Slave Act for a second, because it was a huge deal. This law wasn't just for the South. It basically made every citizen in the country a potential slave catcher. It meant that even if you lived in a free state like Massachusetts, you were legally required to help capture someone who had escaped slavery. If you refused, you could face hefty fines and even jail time.
And here's the absolute key point. The law forced Northerners to face the reality of slavery up close. They couldn't just ignore it anymore. Many felt like it made them accomplices in a system they thought was completely wrong, and it just sparked massive outrage and resistance all across the North.
And that resistance, it took a lot of different forms. Abolitionists, like the incredible Harriet Tubman, ramped up their efforts on the Underground Railroad. Some northern states fought back by passing their own personal liberty laws to try and protect escapees. And then there was Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a novel that became a cultural sensation, showing millions of Americans the brutal human cost of slavery for the first time.
So, you gotta remember, the Compromise of 1850, it didn't actually solve anything. It was really just a temporary truce, and the Fugitive Slave Act, in particular, just poured gasoline on the fire, making the division between North and South so much deeper.
Well, that truce lasted for all of 4 years. Then, in 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas is back with a new plan. He wants to organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories to make way for a transcontinental railroad. But to get the South on board, he had to tear open the whole slavery debate again.
His solution was this idea called popular sovereignty. And on the surface, it sounds pretty democratic, right? Just let the people who actually move to the territory vote on whether or not to have slavery. I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
Well, there was a huge problem. To let popular sovereignty happen in Kansas and Nebraska, the new law had to get rid of a line that had kept the peace for over 30 years, the old Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees 30. By erasing that line, the act suddenly opened up huge new territories to the possibility of slavery.
The political fallout was just immediate. It was an earthquake. The Whig Party, which was already kind of shaky, completely fell apart. The Democrats split right down the middle, North versus South, and out of all that chaos, a brand new party was born, made up of Northerners who were all united by one single issue.
And what was this new party? It was the Republican Party. Its main goal was simple and direct: stop slavery from spreading into the Western territories. Now, they weren't calling for an end to slavery everywhere, but just their existence was seen as a major threat by the South.
Meanwhile, back in Kansas, popular sovereignty just devolved into a mini-civil war. Pro-slavery folks from Missouri, called border ruffians, poured over the border to vote illegally and set up a pro-slavery government. So the anti-slavery settlers just set up their own rival government. Pretty soon, both sides had guns and things got violent, leading to attacks like the Sack of Lawrence and the Potawatomi Massacre.
And this fighting in Bleeding Kansas really marked a turning point. For abolitionists like John Brown, the time for peaceful talks was over. They were now convinced that violence was the only way to destroy slavery. The lesson from Kansas was painfully clear. Stephen Douglas's big idea of popular sovereignty, which sounded so nice and democratic, was a total failure in the real world. It didn't lead to a peaceful vote, it led to bloodshed. So the battle had been fought in Congress and out on the plains of Kansas. Now the whole fight moved to the highest court in the nation. In 1857, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that was an absolute bombshell, and it made the crisis so much worse. The case was all about a man named Dred Scott. So, on what grounds did he sue for his freedom? Well, Scott argued that because his owner had taken him to live in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin, he had legally become a free man. It seems pretty logical, right? The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, not only ruled against Scott, but they went way further. Taney wrote that black people, whether they were enslaved or free, were not citizens and could never be U.S. citizens. And because of that, they had no right to even sue in federal court. But then came the biggest bombshell. The court said Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories, which meant the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. And here is the crucial political impact. With that one ruling, the Supreme Court basically tried to make the entire Republican Party's platform illegal. Their main goal, using Congress to stop the spread of slavery, was now officially declared unconstitutional. It was a staggering victory for the South.
This whole thing put Stephen Douglas in a really tight spot. During his famous debates with Abraham Lincoln in 1858, he came up with something called the Freeport Doctrine. It was a clever workaround. He argued that, okay, even if the court says you can't ban slavery, people in a territory could still keep it out by simply refusing to pass the local laws needed to protect slave property.
You have to remember, the Dred Scott decision was a legal earthquake. To the north, it looked like proof of a massive slave power conspiracy that went all the way to the top. And for the South, it was this huge victory that just hardened their position and made them even less willing to compromise. After the court's ruling, any real path to compromise was pretty much gone. The final events of the 1850s, a shocking raid and a completely fractured election, would be what finally pushed the nation over the edge. In October 1859, John Brown, the same guy from Bleeding Kansas, was back. He led a small group of men to raid the federal weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was to grab all the guns, hand them out to enslaved people in the area, and kick off a massive rebellion that would finally end slavery for good. The raid failed. Brown was captured, and he was hanged for treason. But the reaction to his death, it showed two completely separate worlds. In the North, many saw him as a hero, a martyr who died fighting a great evil. But in the South, he was seen as a terrorist, as absolute proof of their deepest fear, that the North wanted to start a race war and destroy their entire way of life. This was the toxic atmosphere right before the presidential election of 1860. The Democratic Party, which was really the last national institution holding things together, just shattered. The Northern Democrats picked Stephen Douglas, but the Southern Democrats walked out and picked their own guy, John Breckinridge. That split the pro-slavery vote right in two.
And with the Democrats totally divided, the path was wide open for the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln. He won the presidency with just 40% of the popular vote, but he completely dominated the Electoral College by winning almost every single free state.
And for the South, this was it, the final straw. A man whose whole party was designed to stop the spread of slavery had just been elected president, and he did it without winning a single Southern state. To them, this was proof that they had lost all their power in the Union, and in the weeks that followed, South Carolina led the way out.
Okay, let's do a final, super fast review of the must-know facts from this decade. These are the key dominoes that fell one by one, leading straight to the Civil War.
Okay, lock these in. The Compromise of 1850, which brought in California but also gave us that explosive Fugitive Slave Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which killed the Missouri Compromise and led to the creation of the anti-slavery expansion Republican Party. The Dred Scott decision, which tried to make that party's whole platform unconstitutional. And finally, John Brown's raid and Lincoln's election, the 1-2 punch that triggered secession.
Which brings us to a final, really heavy question. The 1850s were just a decade of failed fixes, where every attempt to solve the problem just made it worse. With political compromise totally impossible and the nation's highest court siding with slavery, was the Civil War by 1860 truly inevitable?